All right, good afternoon and welcome to the Seven Hills Fellowship Tuesday devotional. For those of you who've been tuning in for some time now, you know that what I've been doing over the last couple of months is interviewing people from Seven Hills and asking them to simply share their stories of suffering. And in particular, what we have been discovering in all these conversations is that there have been particular verses or simply truths about who God is that have really buoyed and strengthened people in the midst of their trials and in the midst of their suffering. And so it's just been great to be able to share that with one another. Today, Matt Henderson is joining me. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn things over to Matt. And Matt, I'm going to let you simply introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your story. And then I'll just turn it over to you. So thank you for being here with us today.
Yeah, thanks, BP, and thanks for offering to interview with me. And I'm excited to share a little bit about who I am and my story, and hopefully offer a little bit of maybe hope for people who are currently suffering right now too. So, like you said, my name is Matt Henderson. My wife, you may know my wife, Haley. We've been living in Rome for almost 3 years now. We've been going to Seven Hills for about 3 years as well. So. You've probably seen me running outside at a certain point. So I like to run a lot. My wife and I both work at Harbin Clinic here in town. So that's a little bit about who I am, just in the short 15-second version. My story of suffering. I had lost my dad a couple years ago. He was actually diagnosed with liver disease in late 2017. And had been kind of managing it off and on, and would have to kind of go to the doctor, obviously, to go on a low salt diet to help manage the different liver functions that weren't happening anymore. So after several months, he was not really getting any better with liver disease. Just simply managing it on its own wasn't really helping and wasn't reversing any of the disease. So basically, end of April and early May in 2018, after several months of trying to manage it, he actually had to be admitted to the hospital. And there, if you're familiar at all with how the liver functions, if the liver's not working, any kind of toxins aren't getting flushed out of your system. So it can cause a lot of confusion in the person, and can cause a lot of jaundice and everything. So he had to be admitted to the hospital, and he was there for about a week down in Mobile in Alabama. And my wife and I had gone down there to kind of see him, and he really wasn't doing well. And I should say, during this entire time too, we had just moved to Rome. The year before that, I was looking for a job for 4 months, which had kind of compounded a lot of this too. So, but anyway, so he was in the hospital for about a week and really wasn't doing well, and which was really, really difficult to see. Seeing your father in that kind of condition is really stressful and truly trying. So the doctors there said, your father needs a liver transplant, needs it now. So eventually, what had happened after a couple of days of trying to find a bed at UAB hospital, they had found a bed for him there. And so they eventually transferred him there in the middle of the night around Memorial Day 2 years ago, up to UAB hospital. Once they found the bed, my wife had actually gone over there to hold the bed and make sure no one else got it. So they had transferred him there. And then we had followed the ambulance up to Birmingham from Mobile. We went home and packed a bag and just drove up there in the middle of the night. And then when we got there, my dad still was in really, really bad shape, and was confused and wasn't understanding where he was or what was going on. So they kept him there at UAB for a couple of days, and they did a really great job taking care of him. And then he had gotten a little bit better over the course of a couple of days. Eventually, they're saying he needs to be listed for an organ transplant. And so they were working him up and doing all these different procedures and everything. Eventually his condition worsened a little bit more. There are just certain complications that happen with liver disease, and they had to transfer him to the ICU. And then they were monitoring him there, and had to, do a lot of different treatments there. This entire time when Dad was in the ICU, we were in Birmingham. We had nowhere to stay other than a really expensive hotel that was attached to the hospital. We were really blessed by an organization there called Red Mountain Grace that had offered to put us up in an apartment for $10 a night. And what they did was a godsend to us, because it's one thing to have your dad in the hospital and ICU, but then to take all of your stuff, put it in the car, and not know where you're going to sleep that night is just extremely stressful. And I can't understate that enough, or can't overstate that enough. So this entire time, and this happened over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, Dad was in the ICU, and his condition worsened because really he just needed a new liver at that point. He eventually passed away just about 2 years ago exactly from today. And, it's really, the most trying time of my entire life. When you had asked me to speak a little bit about suffering, I knew this was definitely kind of what I had in mind in terms of, there's a lot of suffering, on the part of me and my mom, my entire family, my dad. It was truly trying. And there were so many different instances where we were eating dinner, or we were maybe just talking with doctors, or we were sleeping in the ICU overnight, where you just cry out to God and you're just saying, I do not know why this is happening. I don't know what's going on. This is so different than how I could have possibly imagined my ideal life to go. But it's, 2 years later, it certainly taught me a lot of different things. And it's something that I'll not soon forget.
Is it okay if I call timeout for 1 second?
Yeah.
I want to hear about some of the things you feel like you've learned, especially in retrospect over the last couple of years. But I'd also like to know, like, what was your dad like? Because he was young, right? I mean, so what was he like? Who was he as a person?
Yeah. So my dad, when he was diagnosed with liver disease, was 60 years old. And so he had just turned 60. He had been working his entire life, and he had a very physical job. So he did great, was a great father figure to me. I'm an only child, really looked up to my dad as, my role model and my mentor and my hero. He did so much for me to kind of invest in me and put me through school and put me through college. I was the first in my family to go to college. So he did a lot for me, that was very sacrificial. He gave up a lot of different things. He sold his boat so I could get braces.
Wow.
He did a lot of things for me that, I think, made him like the perfect father figure to me. So yeah, I mean, he was a great father to me. And I think you had mentioned like what I had learned from that.
Yeah.
So, really over time, it's taken me a long time to kind of figure out what I've learned. Over the course of 2 years, there's always something that I see or something that I observe that reminds me of Dad or reminds me of the process. I think that, when right after it happened, really for that first year, it was really difficult. And just like the littlest things, whether it's like a certain part of a hymn that we would sing would make me upset, or just seeing a hospital or seeing a hospital on TV would kind of throw me off a little bit. But over time, kind of what I've picked up or what I've learned really is to not put my faith in things of this world, and not to put too much stake in, what happens here on earth, or to kind of, put too much into what I think about myself or what I think about my situation, because I know that, truly what matters is, what God is doing, what God is orchestrating in our lives. That, yes, this is a very stressful and demanding part of my life. But what am I gonna take from this, and what is God trying to show me here?
Yeah.
That's what I've really learned over time.
Yeah. It's interesting. You used the word hope at the beginning, and I think you essentially said that I hope, or I would like to think that my story can be used to sort of help other people have some hope.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because that's one of the things that I really wrestled with when I had, my diagnosis was I wanted to make sure not to place my hope in my immediate circumstances, whether bad or good, because ultimately I knew that, whether I died at 48 or, 88, that I was going to die. And so my hope better not be in my immediate circumstances, because at some point in time, those circumstances are not going to be in my favor. And so it sounds like there's something in that that's part of your story and growth as well. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember sitting there, when Dad was in the ICU and his brothers had come up to see us, and we're sitting there eating Hungry How's pizza. I'm like, I don't know how this could get any worse. I mean, this is just like the worst situation I could imagine times 100. And so you truly feel hopeless. You feel like, you read the Psalms and say, God, why have you forsaken me? And that's exactly what's going through my mind. It's like, God, you must have just forgotten about me, because if you hadn't, you wouldn't have led me to this situation right now. But it's interesting, to be in such a place of hopelessness and despair that truly that's the only way that you can see the pure hope and pure joy that's on the inverse, and that's on the other side of it, is to truly see the dark side of it. Once you've seen that darkest of dark moments of your life, that's when the true hope becomes a lot more clear. And again, it doesn't become clearer instantly. Over time, it certainly becomes more clear.
Yeah. So one of the things that, in doing these interviews over the years, and I hear you talking about it in your story, it feels to me like suffering has a tendency to do one of two things to people. Suffering either crushes people, or oftentimes what suffering can do is it can make them better, make them more beautiful, make them stronger. But there is a tendency within the Christian world sometimes to skip over the suffering and move right to the good news, if that makes sense. But I hear you in your story, I hear you talking about some of the really hard things, but also some of the hopeful things. Did you wrestle through that tension?
Oh yeah. I mean, for a long time, and even still now, I mean, there could be things that like trigger like negative thoughts or emotions, but it's easier for me to have a different perspective on it, and a more Christian perspective on it. But I think it's our human nature to think, in that, months or year, however long it is afterwards, to just be in a rut. And I think that that's okay. And God knows that, like, okay, you're going to be in a rut. There's just so many times, like in that first year after someone passes away, it's the first Father's Day. It's his, the first birthday since he had passed. It's my first birthday since he had passed. And you start seeing things like, his name isn't on a card anymore. It's little things like that it's really, really difficult to avoid, and it's hard not to see, because it's something that you've seen for such a long time and you're used to it. So, but I think that, as time goes on, you learn to kind of cry out to God and say, God, just help me, help me to see this differently. Help me to see this how you want me to, or how I really should as a Christian,
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I've transitioned that way.
Yeah, one of my favorite verses in the Bible is 1 Thessalonians 4:13, which says, "For we do not grieve as those who have no hope."
Mm-hmm.
And so obviously the second half of the verse is focusing on the hope that we have in Christ. Mm-hmm. But the first half, it's not saying that we don't grieve. It's just saying we don't grieve as those who have no hope.
Right.
And so the grieving piece of it is something that so often I think as Christians we're tempted to fly by, or there are other people that get trapped in the grieving process and don't have the hope. And so one of the beautiful things about being a believer is that we can grieve, but we also have hope at the same time.
Right. Exactly.
Man, but again, I can't imagine. And the fact that your dad was so young, that's just heartbreaking. Yeah. And to be honest, like, what a cool guy to sell his boat in order to get you braces. I mean, that is, like, if that's not an image of God, I don't know what is.
And he loved that boat too. And this was a big boat. I mean, this wasn't like a little kayak thing. I mean, this was a pretty big boat that we had to park in the backyard. So
oh yeah,
it was very sacrificial, and people told me to have a great smile. So I truly attest that to my dad.
That's awesome. I love it, man. I love that. as somebody who is a wannabe saltwater fisherman, I understand the depth of that sacrifice,
Yeah.
and I love the fact that you're able to sort of remember him in that way.
Right.
So, well, listen, let me call timeout.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've been suggesting to people is to maybe come back around and have a part two for some of these interviews. And so I'd love to have you back because
Sure.
I'm sure there's a lot more to your story.
Yeah.
And so let's have you back, and I'd love to hear more about it.
Sure. That'd be
So,
great.
all right. Thank you very much, Matt. I appreciate it, man.
You're welcome. Thanks, BP.